Debuting in 1988, Conspiracy was the 25th episode of the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation. Apparently it was even conceived by Gene Roddenberry, although at that time it was titled The Assassins. This episode has always been one of my favorites, if not my favorite Star Trek The Next Generation episode. And I think the episode also contains the greatest missed opportunity in the Star Trek franchise. So I'd like to talk about the episode just really briefly and maybe encourage you to go watch it if you haven't seen the episode already. The episode starts off with a nice little fake out, which is kind of refreshing because it's not usual for Star Trek to do that in my opinion. The opening dialogue just plays really well into the idea that it's going to be a typical Trek episode.
Swimming is too much like bathing.
And then they switch gears pretty effectively. Picard gets wooed into a meeting between himself and some other captains.
Vitalics B. We'll be waiting.
And I just want to say, for me, this scene right here is total min-maxing. They're using really minimal resources and hardly anything going on, but they're getting a maximum effect. Everything from the way the questions are asked.
Tell me, Jean-Luc, where did we first meet?
Answer the question.
Tau Ceti 3. It's a bar. Quite an exotic one, as I remember. What do I win?
Do you recall the night you introduced Jack Crusher to Beverly?
Know full well that I hadn't met Beverly then. You introduced them.
My brother introduced them.
You don't have a brother. Two sisters, Anne and Melissa. What the hell is all this about?
Everything from the way the questions are asked to the way the shadows reflect on the walls and the faces of the actors is just really well done. The sparse background sets the mood, but also lets you focus on everyone's emoting. It's just a really good scene, and like I said, there's not a lot involved. As the episode goes on, it's revealed that there's some kind of hidden forces pulling the strings behind Starfleet's movements and reassignments. We get to see some awesome Data talking to himself and reading the screen like an absolute mad lad. When Picard goes to confront the Admiralty of Starfleet to unravel the Great Conspiracy himself, everything here is being min-maxed the same way that first scene is. It's really creepy and fucking weird and off-putting, and it's not exactly the kind of thing that you usually see from Star Trek.
To the Horatio, gentlemen.
The Horatio. It's interesting that you should mention the Horatio. It's one of the subjects I wanted to discuss. Really? Has the cause of her destruction been ascertained?
Implosion. Due to the extreme negligence of her captain.
It's a very minimal amount with a very potent effect. The mealworms are an extra creepy weird touch that helps accent the bizarreness of all these scenes. Mealworms don't seem that unusual or unordinary these days, but they really mesh with the vibe in here. I don't know how else you can say it, but like, these possessed people just feel like they'd be eating mealworms. The episode culminates in this really awesome scene, which I guess actually involved them blowing up a head that was made of meat. It's definitely unusual for Star Trek to provide us with a Raiders of the Lost Ark style ending, but this is exactly what we get here. And not only do we get the head exploding, but we get this horrible fucking monster. And to this day, this monster makes my skin crawl. The expression on Picard's face says everything. There's no way you can look at this thing without utter disgust. It must be killed. And again, that's pretty unusual for Star Trek, which is kind of cool. So hopefully you see a little bit now why I like the episode. I don't want to go into much more detail than I already have already. Just go watch it yourself if you haven't seen it. It's super good. If you have seen it, you probably already know what I mean. So I'd like to go forward into saying that I think this is the largest missed opportunity in the Star Trek franchise. It was really cool. They just had a very interesting, threatening plot going on, and the pseudo-horror vibe really worked. It's a very similar concept to the Borg in a lot of ways, as in they are taking over bodies and assimilating them, but I think they're a lot more intimidating and threatening than the Borg. Certainly they're just as mysterious, and I think while a little bit cheesy, they would have been an equally interesting threat to see the Federation face, and I could see it spilling over and affecting any number of other races in the Alpha and Beta quadrants. As we see in the episode, the parasitic creatures that are dominating the conspiracy don't seem to care who they're attached to. They just need to attach themselves to a brain. And in the wonderful Star Trek universe and in TNG itself, it's explored that all the races that exist, or at least the majority of them, come from a common ancestor, so they kind of have, similar structuring of biology to the point where they have brains and such. Given this, the symbiotes would have been reasonably effective at assimilating most of the major empires in the Star Trek galaxy. And all in all, I just think it would have been a really cool and interesting plot. If you want to think about how in the TNG era it could have been implemented, it could have been the subplot that was operating under all of the political plots and intrigue that were occurring throughout the show, and it could have culminated at some point revealing that a bunch of the central conflicts were actually caused by this greater conspiracy, this greater conflict that had gone unsolved, and then the Enterprise and the Federation would have been forced to solve that situation. And if you wanted to think about how this could be utilized in future Star Treks, I would say these creatures would make a really interesting adversary for a future series. Once again, I would slip them in as an underplot to a series of other major plots. You could have various conflicts throughout the galaxy between races and such that Starfleet tries to resolve, and sometimes even appears to resolve, but in reality, it could be part of a greater conspiracy where these creatures were pulling the strings all across the Alpha and Beta Quadrant. Alternatively, I think it would also make a really interesting Star Trek game. I personally love Star Trek games, and I've played the vast majority of them. I even have a computer rigged up here all weird so I can play Generations on its 95 format. It doesn't always work out properly, but, we're getting the bugs out right now. This was actually pretty similar to what happened in the Deep Space Nine The Fallen game, which is one of the best Star Trek games out there, and still holds up in modern gaming in my opinion. It's a really cool game. In that game, there is an enemy that's kind of a mysterious, OP alien force that comes out of the interior of the galaxy that's relatively unexplored, and it threatens everyone's existence. Well, at least it threatens Bajor, and the Pah-wraiths are involved. It's a whole thing. You gotta play the game. And I think it would be interesting to see these aliens incorporated into a plot in a Star Trek game, because you'd have to go about solving them and combating them in different ways than you would typical enemies. And I think it could add a lot of extra layers of gameplay to any sort of next-gen games that feature Star Trek. Well, I hope I persuaded you, if you haven't seen the episode, to go check it out, and if you have seen the episode, I hope I persuaded you that it was a pretty big missed opportunity in Star Trek, and that there could be a lot of future to this storyline, especially for people who fondly remember the Next Generation and DS9 era. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.